Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, the place where every cold case, chilling crime, and unsolved mystery is brought back to life. From vanished persons to twisted betrayals, we dig deep into the unknown to uncover the truth that others left buried. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far the mystery travels. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a case. Because here, some truths are only heard in the dead quiet. Miss Marple and murder runs in the bloodline. Chapter 1. The Letter from Clara. The golden sun was beginning its slow descent behind the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, casting long, honeyed shadows over the neat hedgerows and cobbled footpaths. In the heart of this tranquil English village, Miss Jane Marple sat serenely in her garden, a ball of pale blue wool resting in her lap, and her nimble fingers quietly at work with the needles. The rhythmic click of knitting accompanied the gentle rustling of leaves, stirred by the soft evening breeze. Every so often she paused to observe the marigolds and delphiniums that nodded cheerfully in their beds, their colours deepening in the fading light. The scene was one of perfect peace, until a crisp rustle broke the stillness. Glancing up, Miss Marple noticed her maid, Edna, stepping through the gate with a brown envelope in hand. "Post just arrived, Mum. Special delivery," Edna said, holding it out with a curious tilt of her head. Miss Marple reached for the envelope, noting the familiar scrawl on the front. Her brows arched delicately. "Why, it's from Clara," she murmured, already slicing open the seal with a slender silver knife. Clara Hadwell, an old school friend from her youth, had always been vivacious, occasionally dramatic, and never short of a story worth hearing. They had corresponded intermittently over the years, but Clara rarely wrote without purpose. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and began reading. "Dear Jane, I hope this letter finds you in good spirits. Life in Heatherwick is steady, though peculiar events have lately disturbed our sleepy village. There's something I must tell you. For the past several years, 3 sisters, Ruth, Mabel, and Elsie Crowthorne, have lived together in the old Briarwood house on the hill. All 3 are widows and quite unlike one another. Ruth, the eldest, is a commanding sort, firm, exacting, and never short of an opinion. Mabel follows closely in her shadow, pliable and timid, ever eager to please. Elsie, the youngest, is a different breed entirely, spirited, modern in her ideas, and often at odds with her sisters. One always had the sense she did not quite belong under that roof. Just last week, Elsie died. It was all very sudden. I hesitate to call it suspicious, but, well, you understand the sort of feeling one gets when things don't sit right. There's a shadow over Briarwood, Jane. I can't explain it clearly, but I believe something is amiss. I do hope you will come. You've always had a remarkable instinct for these things. There's more here than meets the eye, and I rather think you would find it intriguing. Your friend always, Clara." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and sat back in her chair, the knitting momentarily forgotten. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon where the sky had turned a muted lavender. She could hear the distant toll of the church bell marking 6 o'clock. Clara's letter wasn't merely idle village gossip. It carried weight, the kind born of long-held intuition and careful observation. Clara had been many things, but never hysterical. If she sensed something was wrong, it likely was. 2 days later, with remarkable efficiency, Miss Marple had arranged for her neighbour to care for her cat, left instructions for Edna, and packed a modest case containing her essentials, a warm shawl, her favourite teacup, and a small black notebook. The weather forecast had promised fair skies, but Miss Marple, ever cautious, included an umbrella nonetheless. She boarded the 9:42 train to Heatherwick from Paddington Station, taking her seat in a quiet corner of the carriage. The countryside blurred past in shades of green and gold, the fields broken by stone walls and grazing sheep. She spent most of the journey gazing thoughtfully through the window, the letter safely tucked in her handbag. When the train finally chugged into Heatherwick's small, ivy-covered station, Miss Marple stepped down with poise, surveying her unfamiliar surroundings. The platform was quiet, save for a few hens clucking in the nearby hedges and a porter wheeling a solitary trunk. Just as she adjusted her grip on the handle of her bag, a voice called out from behind her. "Excuse me, are you Miss Marple?" She turned and found herself facing a gentleman in his early 50s. He was dressed in a well-pressed brown tweed coat, a thin scarf tucked neatly into the collar. His face was pleasant, though marked with slight weariness, and his spectacles caught the light as he offered a courteous smile. "Yes," she replied with a faint nod. "And you are?" "Edward Colby. I'm the village doctor. Clara asked me to meet you. She's a bit tied up at the moment with the vicar's wife, who's had another turn with her nerves. Thought it best I fetch you myself. I had a house call not far from here anyway." "Well, how kind of you, Dr. Colby," Miss Marple said warmly. "I imagine Clara has filled you in on the matter?" He glanced around, then bent slightly closer. "She mentioned a few things, nothing terribly concrete, mind you, but, well, Briarwood has always had a peculiar air. Old house, older secrets." They began walking together down a narrow lane that wound past thick hedgerows and dry stone walls. The late afternoon light filtered through tall elms, dappling the path with gold and shadow. As they walked, Miss Marple noted the neatness of the cottages, the absence of chatter in the air, the slightly overgrown hedges, as if the village had turned inward upon itself. "Were you acquainted with the sisters?" she asked gently. "Oh yes," Edward replied, adjusting his pace to match hers. "I've treated all three at various times. Ruth suffers from migraines, Mabel has a touch of arthritis, and Elsie, well, she rarely needed anything. She was the healthiest of them all, if you ask me. Her passing, it was unexpected." "You were the one to attend her?" He hesitated. "I examined her after the fact. Heart failure, it was said. But there was something about her expression, peaceful, yes, but strained, as if something troubled her right before the end." Miss Marple offered no reply, but her brow furrowed ever so slightly. They walked on in silence for a few moments, the only sound the gravel crunching beneath their feet and the occasional chirrup of a bird preparing for dusk. In the distance, a weather vane creaked above a slate roof, and the sharp spire of the village church rose against the purple sky. As they approached the village centre, a tall wrought-iron gate came into view. Beyond it, half concealed by overgrown rose bushes, stood a grand yet weary-looking house. Its shutters hung slightly askew, and the paint on the porch rails had begun to peel. A place once proud, now sagging under the weight of time, and perhaps secrets. "Briarwood House," Edward said, gesturing ahead, "where it all begins and perhaps where it ends." Miss Marple paused for a moment, then resumed walking, her eyes never leaving the house. "Yes," she murmured, "we shall see." Chapter 2. Echoes in the Drawing Room. Morning had broken gently over Heatherwick. A faint mist still clung to the trees as birds stirred in the hedgerows, their songs soft and unhurried. Clara's cottage, modest yet charming, was bathed in pale sunlight that streamed through lace curtains into the parlour. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, delicately spreading marmalade onto toast, while Clara sipped tea beside her. They had spoken little since returning from Briarwood House the previous evening. There had been no need. Miss Marple's mind was quietly at work, fitting together small observations like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, faces, tones of voice, even pauses in conversation. She had learned long ago that what was not said often revealed more than what was. After breakfast, Clara rose and fetched her handbag. "They'll be expecting us again," she said, glancing towards the window. "Ruth mentioned she had something more to show you." Miss Marple nodded, setting aside her napkin with care. "I rather think I should like to see it." The walk to Briarwood House was brisker that morning, the sunlight warm against their coats. As they turned onto the gravel path leading to the gate, Miss Marple once again noted the weary air of the place. Despite its stately facade, the house had a heaviness to it, as though the walls themselves had absorbed too many whispered arguments and unspoken griefs. The maid from the previous day, Marjorie, if Miss Marple recalled correctly, opened the door before they even reached the porch. "Miss Ruth is in the parlour," she said with a stiff nod. "She's been waiting." Inside, the air was cool and scented faintly with lavender and old smoke. Ruth stood near the window, dressed in a grey wool suit that was impeccably tailored, but unmistakably outdated. Mabel sat meekly in an armchair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression as fragile as porcelain. "Ah, Miss Marple," Ruth said, turning with a brisk smile. "So good of you to come back. I thought it might interest you to see some of Elsie's personal things." "Thank you," Miss Marple replied gently. "I should like that very much." Ruth led them into the adjoining sitting room, where a few boxes had been placed on a low table. One was filled with travel brochures, Rome, Vienna, Tangier, and another contained postcards and trinkets. Miss Marple picked up a small silver elephant, its back engraved with the word Jaipur. "She kept all these?" she asked. "Oh yes," said Mabel softly. She adored collecting things from the places she visited. "She travelled alone?" Miss Marple asked, watching Ruth's face carefully. "For the most part," Ruth replied smoothly. "Elsie liked her freedom. She always said she preferred strangers to family, less judgment, more adventure." There was a brittle edge to her voice that Miss Marple didn't miss. "She sounds like she had spirit," Clara offered, trying to lighten the mood. "She did," said Mabel, and for a moment her eyes sparkled. "She wasn't afraid of much, not like me." Miss Marple gave her a warm look. "You strike me as someone with quiet strength, Miss Mabel. That often runs deeper than anyone suspects." Mabel smiled faintly, but her gaze dropped to her lap. A moment later, Ruth gestured toward the photograph album from the previous day. "You seemed curious about that photograph," she said. "The man by the lake." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I did wonder who he was." "As I said, a distant cousin," Ruth replied. "He left for Canada many years ago. There was some disagreement over land, I believe. Family business, unpleasant, and best left in the past." There was something clipped in her tone now, final, as if she had placed a full stop at the end of a sentence not meant to be reopened. "I understand," Miss Marple said lightly. "Families are rarely simple." They continued to sift through Elsie's belongings, some books, a diary from her school days, and a few framed photographs. As Miss Marple studied them, she felt an odd sensation creeping in. It wasn't what she saw that disturbed her, it was what was missing. There were no recent photographs of Elsie and her sisters together, no celebrations, no casual snapshots of daily life, just isolated portraits, fragments of a life seemingly lived apart, even within the same household. After a polite interval, Miss Marple thanked Ruth and Mabel once more and excused herself with Clara. As they walked back through the village, Clara turned to her. "Well," she asked, "what do you think?" Miss Marple paused to admire a climbing rose along a cottage wall before replying. "There's something hollow at the heart of that house, Clara. I felt it the moment we stepped inside." Clara frowned. "You think they're hiding something?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Perhaps not deliberately, but families sometimes bury the truth without even realizing it. out of pride or habit or shame. Ruth is composed, excessively so, and Mabel, she's walking in a shadow that I suspect has grown too heavy for her. Clara's face tightened. I never particularly liked Ruth, you know. There's something controlling about her. Elsie was always the most alive of the three. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, and sometimes the brightest flame draws the strongest winds. They walked on in silence for a few moments. Back at Clara's cottage, Miss Marple sat down by the fireplace and withdrew a small notebook from her handbag. She opened it and jotted down a few notes. Ruth equals dominant, Mabel equals dependent, Elsie equals independent. Or isolated? No mention of how Elsie died exactly. Cousin in photo equals left after dispute. She tapped her pencil thoughtfully against the page. Just then Clara brought in a tray of tea and biscuits. "I do hope you're not overthinking it," Clara said, handing her a cup. "Sometimes a death is just that, a death." Miss Marple took the cup with a smile, but her eyes remained distant. "Perhaps," she said. "But sometimes, Clara, death is the last word in a sentence that began long ago. And I think Elsie's sentence was interrupted. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village. By mid-morning, the village of Heatherwick had begun to stir with a quiet rhythm. Smoke curled from the chimneys, hens clucked behind garden walls, and the postman's bicycle creaked along the lane. But Miss Marple was already up and dressed, her mind working steadily like the ticking of a well-kept clock. As she fastened her brooch and reached for her gloves, one thought had anchored itself firmly. Elsie's death was no ordinary passing. In villages like these, secrets rarely stayed buried long. If something odd had occurred, someone would have noticed, whether consciously or not. And Miss Marple had always believed that the truth in such places was like a ripple in still water. You only had to know where to watch. After breakfast with Clara, she decided to take a walk into the village centre. Heatherwick was a handsome little place, its cottages smothered in climbing roses and wisteria. Along the main lane stood a popular general store, the sort of shop that sold everything from knitting wool to biscuits, and most importantly, offered the currency of any village, the latest word. The small bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple stepped inside. Shelves lined with tins and flour sacks gave the shop a slightly musty charm. Behind the counter stood a robust woman with red cheeks and an apron tied tightly at the waist. Her eyes lit up with immediate recognition. "You must be the guest from St. Mary Mead," she said, folding a piece of brown paper. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Word does travel fast around here." The woman gave a hearty laugh. "Oh, by tea time, we've heard every sneeze, every scandal, and every visitor's surname." Miss Marple chuckled lightly, then added, "Yes, I visited the Crowthorne sisters yesterday." "Such a sad affair, the passing of the youngest, Elsie." The woman's hands stilled for a moment. "Sad, yes, but if you ask me, strange. She was always the healthiest of the three. Sprightly, lively. She'd walk to the old mill and back while the others sat indoors with their knitting." "Did she have many visitors?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light, almost casual. "Not many," the shopkeeper replied, lowering her voice slightly. "Though I did hear that a woman, someone from outside, came to see her just before her death. No one seems to know who she was, not from this village, that's for certain." Before Miss Marple could inquire further, the door swung open behind her. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepped in, bringing with him a draught of cool air and the scent of the churchyard. The woman beamed. "Reverend Lionel, just in time." The vicar nodded to both women. "Miss Marple, I presume?" "Yes," she said warmly. "Clara mentioned you." "I was just saying," he began, "that our church owes a great deal to the Crowthorne sisters. They fund the flower arrangements, support the repairs, and Ruth attends service every week without fail. It's a matter of family tradition, I believe." He smiled politely, then added, "Would you care to see the church? It's rather beautiful in the morning light." Miss Marple accepted his offer, and together they strolled to the small stone church, set just beyond the village green. The iron gate creaked as they entered, and dew still glistened on the headstones. Inside, the chapel was hushed and elegant. Stained glass filtered the sunlight into soft hues of amber and blue. The pews were polished smooth with age, and a faint scent of beeswax hung in the air. Reverend Lionel led her through the nave, pointing out a memorial plaque dedicated to the sister's father, a Colonel Crowthorne decorated in the Great War. "They were proud of him," the vicar remarked. "Ruth especially. She keeps a tight grip on the family legacy." They paused by the altar before he turned and said warmly, "You must come to the vicarage for tea. My wife Dorothy would be glad of your company." At the vicarage, a soft-spoken woman with silvering hair and kind eyes ushered them into a sunlit parlour. After tea had been poured and pleasantries exchanged, Dorothy leaned forward slightly. "There's something that's been on my mind," she began cautiously. "Just before Elsie died, a woman came to visit her at Briarwood House. No one recognized her, not even Marjorie, the maid. And later that evening, the sisters had a dreadful row. We could hear it from our garden, shouting, unlike them entirely." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "Did you see the woman?" "Only from a distance. Younger than the sisters, I'd say. Well-dressed. She stayed no more than an hour." Miss Marple made a mental note. An unknown woman, an argument, and then Elsie's death. After thanking the vicar and his wife for their hospitality, she made her way back along the winding lane toward Clara's cottage. The crisp breeze stirred the trees above her, but her thoughts were elsewhere, focused, deliberate. It was then that she spotted a familiar figure walking toward her, Dr. Edward Colby. "Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his collar, "I was hoping to run into you." She offered a smile. "I was about to say the same. I wanted to speak with you privately, in fact. You asked about Elsie's death. It was diagnosed as a heart attack, but I'm not entirely convinced." "No?" Edward shook his head. There were symptoms that didn't fit. Her pulse was erratic, but not in the usual way. Her skin had a strange discoloration, faint but noticeable to the trained eye. It reminded me of certain rare toxins, though I have no proof. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you were her regular physician?" "Yes, I'd seen her just a week earlier. She was in good spirits, laughing in fact. Not a woman expecting death." They walked together a short while. "Oh, and one more thing," Edward added. "Clara's still staying at Briarwood House. Ruth invited her to spend the night, and you've been asked to return tomorrow morning. The sister's family solicitor is arriving from London. Apparently, there's a matter concerning Elsie's will." Miss Marple slowed her pace, digesting the information. "Victor, I believe his name is," Edward said. "Victor Penrose, a rather well-regarded legal man." "I see," Miss Marple replied. "Wills often shine a light where people would rather keep things hidden." With a final nod, she turned down the path to Clara's cottage. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the shadows deepened along the walls, Miss Marple sat quietly in an armchair with her notebook open. Her pen hovered above the page before she wrote, "Unknown visitor. Argument, sudden death, medical doubts, solicitor arriving." She tapped the pen lightly, thinking, and then underlined it once. Not natural. Chapter 4. The Vanishing Will. The sitting room at Briarwood was unusually quiet that afternoon. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway marked each second with exaggerated solemnity, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The conversation with the solicitor had ended, but the ripples it caused had not yet settled. Miss Marple sat beside Mabel's bed, her knitting untouched on her lap. The younger woman had drifted into a light sleep, her breathing soft and steady, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere, drawn to what she had witnessed only moments ago. Ruth, rummaging through Elsie's room with the urgency of someone searching for more than nostalgia. It was clear now. Ruth believed that Elsie had indeed altered her will, and she was determined to find it before anyone else did. The original will, as the solicitor had confirmed, left everything to the surviving sisters in equal measure. But if Elsie had changed that, well, Ruth's inheritance might be at risk. And Ruth did not strike Miss Marple as the sort of woman who relinquished anything easily. Just then, the door creaked open, and Clara peeked in. "Is she resting?" Miss Marple nodded. "Sleeping, I think. Poor dear looks quite exhausted." Clara entered quietly, her face troubled. Ruth seemed upset after the meeting, more than just frustration. It was almost panic. Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Yes, panic is often the mask worn by those who fear exposure rather than loss." Clara glanced at the sleeping Mabel and lowered her voice. "What do you think happened to Elsie?" Miss Marple folded her hands gently over her knitting. I think we're only beginning to understand who Elsie really was, and more importantly, who she wasn't." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple tilted her head. A woman who, by all accounts, was independent, curious, fond of music and travel and possibly in love, at least once. And yet no one really talks about her life outside this house, not even Mabel. "She did say Elsie had a visitor before her death," Clara recalled. "Indeed," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "A woman no one could identify, and shortly after, a fierce argument." Just then, Mabel stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, and she blinked up at the two women. "Oh," she murmured. "Still here?" "Of course, dear," said Miss Marple, rising to pour her a glass of water. "Just checking you're comfortable." Mabel accepted the drink and sipped slowly, then sat up slightly. I remember something," she said suddenly. "The day before Elsie died." Miss Marple leaned forward gently. "Yes, Mabel." She came home with a small envelope in her handbag. It was sealed and marked private. She wouldn't say what it was, just smiled and said, "It's something that will make things right." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Did she hide it? I don't know. But she went into her room that night and locked the door. That wasn't like her. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Clara. "Thank you, Mabel," she said softly. "That's most helpful." After ensuring Mabel was resting comfortably again, the two women slipped out of the room. In the hallway, Miss Marple paused beside a small table and reached for her handbag. "I think it's time I had another look at Elsie's room," she said. "Properly this time." Clara hesitated. "Shouldn't we ask Ruth?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "We shan't disturb anything, but I believe there's more in that room than music boxes." They walked quietly to the end of the corridor. The door to Elsie's room creaked slightly as Miss Marple pushed it open. The scent of lavender and polish still lingered. Everything had been tidied, perhaps too tidily. Clara stood near the bookshelf while Miss Marple made her way to the dressing table. The drawers opened smoothly, revealing carefully folded scarves, an old silver brush, and a faded photograph of the three sisters as young girls, smiling at the edge of a lake. "No sign of any document," Clara whispered. "Number. But if one wished to hide something of importance, one wouldn't leave it in plain sight," Miss Marple replied, scanning the room with sharp eyes. She walked to the row of music boxes on the sideboard. There were 5 of them, each ornately crafted and delicately painted. One played a waltz, another a lullaby. She wound one absent-mindedly and watched the tiny dancer spin. Then she paused. She reached for the last box, smaller than the rest, painted a dull blue with faint gold trim. As she turned the key, it clicked oddly as if something inside resisted. She opened the lid. No music played. Clara leaned in. "Is it broken?" "No," Miss Marple murmured. "It's been tampered with." She ran her finger along the inner base and tapped lightly. The bottom panel shifted slightly under pressure. With a delicate motion, she lifted it away, and there, nestled beneath, was a folded envelope, yellowing at the edges. Clara gasped. Could it be? Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her voice was cool and steady. It could, and I suspect it is. She slipped the envelope into her handbag. "We'll take it straight to Victor," she said. "But we shan't mention how we came by it. Not yet." In the drawing room, Ruth was pouring herself a cup of tea when the 2 women entered. Her eyes flicked to them with polite suspicion. "Back so soon?" "Just checking on Mabel again," Miss Marple said smoothly. "She seems a little stronger." "Good," Ruth replied, but her tone lacked conviction. Victor had returned from a walk and now stood by the fireplace, leafing through papers. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Mr. Victor, I believe I've found something that may be of interest to you." She handed him the envelope. He took it carefully, adjusted his spectacles, and opened it. Inside was a neatly written document, signed and dated, and bearing a witness signature. It's a revised will," he said slowly. "Executed 3 weeks before Elsie's death." "And what does it say?" Ruth asked quickly, her eyes narrowing. Victor read silently for a moment, then looked up. "She left the entire estate to Mabel, solely." There was a stunned silence. Ruth's face darkened. "That can't be right. Elsie would never—" "She did," Victor said quietly, "and it's legally sound." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she set her teacup down. "I see." Miss Marple watched her carefully, then turned to Mabel, who had just entered the room, pale but composed. "Mabel," she said gently, "I believe this was Elsie's way of protecting you. Whatever may have happened between the 3 of you, she wanted to make things right." Tears welled in Mabel's eyes. "She always did," she whispered. Miss Marple sat back in her chair. The room was filled with silence, but no longer the kind born of secrecy. This was a silence of realization, of old shadows lifting, at least for now. But Miss Marple had one final thought, unspoken. When the truth upsets the balance, it's not the truth we fear. It's what we stand to lose when it arrives. Chapter 5. The Secret Within the Box. Mabel stirred beneath her blankets as the pale light of morning crept through the curtains. Her face was drawn and colourless, and her hands trembled faintly as she clutched at the edge of her coverlet. Miss Marple sat quietly in the chair beside her, alert to every detail, her knitting momentarily forgotten. When Mabel's eyes fluttered open, Miss Marple leaned forward and offered a soft, reassuring smile. "Good morning, my dear. How are you feeling?" Mabel exhaled shakily. "Not well? Not at all. I don't think I have much time left, Miss Marple." "Oh, you mustn't say such things," Miss Marple replied, gently brushing a hand across the younger woman's wrist. "You'll be up and about in no time." But Mabel's eyes carried a shadow that could not be soothed with pleasantries. These are the same signs Elsie had before she passed. I recognized them. The shortness of breath, the weakness, the aching that moves like fog through your bones. I felt it the moment I woke up. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, but inwardly her concern deepened. I assure you, you're under good care. Dr. Edward is keeping a close watch, and I'm here too. Don't let fear guide your thoughts. Mabel gave a faint smile, then looked down at her hands. There's something I need to tell you, she whispered. Something important. Before she could continue, the door creaked open, and Ruth stepped into the room. Her expression was unreadable, her presence instantly imposing. Miss Marple noted the way Mabel's gaze dropped the moment Ruth entered. Whatever fragile courage she had summoned, it vanished in an instant. I hope I'm not interrupting, Ruth said smoothly, though her eyes flicked to the teacup on Miss Marple's side table, as if taking stock of how long she'd been there. We were just talking, Miss Marple replied calmly. Ruth moved closer and laid a hand on Mabel's shoulder. You're looking stronger, darling. I think that's enough for now. Miss Marple, you may leave. Mabel needs rest. Miss Marple was halfway to rising when Mabel suddenly spoke. No, stay, please. Ruth paused, her gaze sharp. I feel better when she's here, Mabel added a little more firmly. After a moment's silence, Ruth gave a small, curt nod. Very well. If it comforts you, then she may stay. She stood for another minute, her posture as stiff as her tone, then said, I'm going to the church. Reverend Lionel requested a few words. As soon as Ruth exited the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click, Miss Marple turned her attention back to Mabel. Now, my dear, what was it you wanted to tell me? But Mabel only shook her head, her eyes full of conflict. Nothing. It doesn't matter now. Miss Marple didn't press. She had learned, through years of observation, that people only speak when they feel truly safe. Instead, she offered, I'll just go and have another look at Elsie's room. There's something I want to check. Mabel didn't protest, only nodded faintly as she lay back against her pillows. Miss Marple walked silently down the corridor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The house was still as if holding its breath. Inside Elsie's room, the scent of lavender polish lingered and sunlight danced across the lace curtains. Everything was as it had been, too perfectly arranged, too deliberately untouched. She moved toward the row of music boxes on the sideboard, her eyes scanning their delicate ornamentation. There were 5 in total, each a different shape and color. Some were shaped like miniature pianos, others like jewelry caskets. She lifted the lid of one and listened to the gentle strains of a waltz. And then her gaze fell on the smallest of the lot, an unremarkable blue box with worn gold detailing along the edges. She picked it up and examined it carefully. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. But as she measured the interior space with her fingers, something didn't align. The box appeared deeper from the outside than it actually was. She tilted it under the light and tapped gently along its base. Her sharp fingers found a small, recessed groove. With delicate pressure, she shifted the false bottom, and it gave way with a subtle click. Beneath it, hidden in the hollow compartment, lay several folded papers. Her breath caught. She reached in and withdrew the documents. They were carefully sealed in a thin parchment envelope, the writing on the front unmistakable. To be opened in the presence of Mr. Victor Penrose, solicitor. She had barely begun to examine the contents when the floorboard creaked behind her. Miss Marple turned. Mabel stood in the doorway, her face pale but composed. So, she said softly, you found it? Elsie's will. Miss Marple didn't flinch. Yes, hidden, but not lost. She carefully placed the envelope inside her handbag. This must be read in front of everyone, with Victor present. It's what Elsie would have wanted. Mabel gave a weak nod, and then, from downstairs, Ruth's voice rang out, echoing up the staircase. Miss Marple and Mabel exchanged a glance. "We mustn't let her suspect," Miss Marple said gently. "Come, let's return to your room before she sees we've been here." They left Elsie's room as it was, orderly, silent, unchanged to the untrained eye. Back in Mabel's room, Miss Marple helped her settle once more beneath the covers. Ruth's footsteps approached, sharp and measured, and moments later she entered with the poise of someone who never believed she needed permission to enter any space. "I see you're both still here," she said coolly. "Mabel needed some fresh water," Miss Marple answered, picking up the pitcher with effortless calm. "We've only just come back from the hallway." Ruth looked between them, her gaze lingering a second longer than necessary, then turned away without another word. As she exited, Miss Marple closed her handbag firmly and sat back in her chair. What she now held in her possession was not just a will, it was a disruption, a revelation, a truth long buried beneath the performance of sisterhood. And Ruth, for all her control, would not let such a truth emerge without resistance. Still, Miss Marple had no intention of hiding it. Elsie had taken great care to protect Mabel even in death. That much was now clear. And so quietly and without ceremony, Miss Marple began preparing for what she knew would be a deeply uncomfortable confrontation. There would be questions, perhaps accusations, but one thing was certain. Tomorrow the hidden will would be read, and with it the house of cards would begin to tremble. Chapter 6. The Name in the Will. The atmosphere in the drawing room of Briarwood House was unusually taut that morning. The chairs had been arranged in a careful semicircle before the fireplace, and the faint ticking of the wall clock was the only sound filling the silence. Outside, grey clouds gathered above the moor, and the first whispers of a coming storm drifted through the partially opened windows. Miss Marple sat quietly with her handbag clasped on her lap, her eyes scanning the tense faces around her. Clara sat beside her, visibly anxious. Ruth stood near the mantelpiece, arms crossed, chin raised in defiance. Mabel, pale and withdrawn, reclined weakly in a cushioned armchair. Even the maid Marjorie lingered longer than usual as she brought in the morning tea tray, her curiosity barely concealed. Victor Penrose, the solicitor from London, arrived promptly at 11, his leather briefcase tucked under one arm and his expression grave, yet composed. After a series of polite greetings, Miss Marple rose and handed him the envelope she had retrieved from the music box. "This is what I believe you've been waiting for," she said, her voice measured. Victor accepted the envelope with a slight nod, took a seat by the writing desk and carefully broke the seal. Pulling out the pages, he adjusted his spectacles and began to read aloud, his voice echoing faintly in the high-ceilinged room. "This is the final testament of Elsie Crowthorne, signed and dated 3 weeks before her death." The room grew still. Even Ruth, who had been shifting impatiently, stood motionless. Victor continued, "I, Elsie Margaret Crowthorne, being of sound mind and full awareness, hereby declare that I wish to amend my previous will. I leave my full share of the family estate and any accompanying financial holdings to Miss Millicent Alistair, and no other. To my sisters, Ruth and Mabel, I assign a modest monthly allowance solely to cover household necessities, as managed through the estate executor." Victor paused, glanced around, then continued, "This decision is made freely and without coercion. Millicent has been like family to me. I trust her implicitly." A cold silence swept through the room, broken only by the sharp intake of Ruth's breath. "Millicent Alistair," she repeated incredulously. "Who is Millicent Alistair?" "I've never even heard the name. Has my sister gone completely mad, leaving her inheritance to some stranger?" "This is nonsense." Her voice rose, trembling not with sorrow, but with fury. She turned to Victor, eyes blazing. "I will not accept this. I'll file a claim against this will. It's outrageous. I am her blood. I lived in this house, and she hands everything to a complete outsider." Victor maintained his composure. "Miss Ruth, your reaction is understandable. However, the will is legally valid and witnessed. It will stand unless successfully challenged in court." Ruth's fists clenched at her sides. "You're siding with a dead woman's whim." Victor closed the folder gently and looked up. "I anticipated there might be some resistance, which is why I contacted Miss Allister. She agreed to come today and clarify her relationship with Elsie." Ruth scoffed, but before she could speak again, the soft knock of the maid at the door drew their attention. Marjorie entered with the tea tray and moved carefully between the guests, setting down cups and saucers without a word. The tension was so thick, it seemed even the porcelain clinked more cautiously than usual. A short while later, just after midday, the doorbell rang. Victor rose and stepped into the hallway. Moments later, he returned, followed by a woman in her early 30s, elegantly dressed in a navy coat and gloves, with a composed expression and clear, steady eyes. "This," said Victor, "is Miss Millicent Allister." All eyes turned toward her. "Good afternoon," she said gently. "Thank you for receiving me." Her voice was soft but firm, with a calmness that immediately shifted the atmosphere. She moved with grace, yet there was no shyness in her demeanor, only poise. "You may explain if you would," Victor invited. Millicent nodded and stepped forward slightly. "My name is Millicent Allister. My mother is Mary Allister. She and Elsie Crowthorne were close friends for many years. When Elsie travelled to London, she often stayed with us. She would spend days in our home, sometimes weeks, especially during the summers." She paused, glancing at Ruth and Mabel. "I've known her since I was a child. She used to bring me small gifts, music boxes, postcards from her travels. She said I reminded her of someone she used to be." Ruth let out a short laugh. "Charming. And that makes you entitled to her fortune?" Millicent looked at her directly. "I never asked for it. I didn't even know she'd named me until Mr. Penrose contacted me last week." Clara leaned forward slightly. "She spoke of you often?" Millicent smiled faintly. "She wrote to my mother regularly, and in later years to me. She once said that being with us made her feel more alive than she ever felt in this house." Mabel stirred at that. Her breathing had grown shallower as the conversation went on. "Are you all right?" Clara asked, rising. "I'm fine," Mabel whispered. "Just a little dizzy." Edward, who had entered quietly moments earlier, stepped forward. "She needs rest. I think she's reached her limit for today." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, best take her to her room." Clara and Edward helped Mabel to her feet, and the three of them left the room slowly, Mabel leaning heavily on Edward's arm. The remaining occupants sat in stunned silence. Victor broke it at last. "There it is. A legal will, a clear beneficiary, a woman your sister knew well, trusted, and admired. Unless you have proof to the contrary, there is little to be contested." Ruth said nothing. Her lips were pressed into a tight line, her knuckles white against the fabric of her sleeve. Miss Marple studied her carefully. For the first time since arriving at Briarwood, Ruth looked unsettled, not in control, not assured. Her composure had cracked just enough to reveal the storm brewing beneath. But Miss Marple's attention wasn't only on Ruth. She glanced at Millicent as well, the poised woman who had just inherited an estate, and possibly something far more dangerous, for where money moved, motive often followed. And though one secret had been revealed, Miss Marple suspected the most important one still lay hidden. Chapter 7. Beneath the Surface. Morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Mabel's room, casting soft patterns on the faded floral wallpaper. Outside, the birds chirped with gentle optimism, but inside the air hung heavy with the hush of illness and secrets waiting to be spoken. Dr. Edward, punctual as ever, arrived just after 8. He moved with quiet purpose, placing his medical bag on the side table and pulling up a chair beside Mabel's bed. Her face was wan, her breathing shallow, and her once bright eyes had dulled with fatigue. After a thorough examination, Edward turned to Miss Marple, who stood silently nearby. "I've taken all I can from her vitals," he said gravely. "Her pulse is irregular, her temperature low. I've sent for a specialist from London, someone with more experience in rare systemic illnesses. She's not stable." Miss Marple nodded once, her hands folded in front of her. "You were right to act quickly." Dr. Edward packed up his instruments, patted Mabel's shoulder, and quietly left the room. Clara, too, departed soon after to speak with the housekeeper. Miss Marple remained, drawing a chair close to the bed. Mabel's voice came in a faint whisper. "Marple." "I'm here, dear." "Didn't you see it?" she said, barely moving her lips. "Millicent, her eyes, her smile, even the way she tilts her head. She looks just like Elsie." Miss Marple leaned forward, brow slightly raised. "So, you noticed it too?" Mabel's eyelids fluttered, and she gave a small, bitter chuckle. "Noticed it? I knew it. The resemblance isn't coincidence." Miss Marple's expression turned sharp with concentration. "You mean you knew from the beginning that Millicent was Elsie's child?" "Yes," Mabel whispered. "I knew. Ruth did too, though she never admitted it outright." Mabel turned her head slightly, wincing with effort. "All 3 of us sisters were once infatuated with a man named Alistair. Tall, charming, clever with words. We were girls then, foolish, romantic, competitive. But it was Elsie he loved." Miss Marple listened, hands resting still on her lap, her face unreadable. "Elsie and Alistair became close," Mabel continued. "Too close. Our father, a proud and controlling man, found out. He was furious. He said Alistair had no future, no title, no family name, worth preserving. Father had him thrown out of the village. Banished." Mabel's voice grew fainter. "Shortly after, Elsie discovered she was pregnant. She confided only in me. To protect the family name, our father sent her away to London. She stayed with her closest friend, Mary Alistair, Alistair's distant cousin. Mary took her in without question." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. "And the child? Millicent?" "She was born in secret," Mabel confirmed. "Elsie returned to Briarwood as though nothing had happened. The baby stayed with Mary. No one in the village ever knew, but Elsie wrote letters, dozens of them. She kept in touch with Mary and with Millicent, watching her grow up from afar." "Ruth didn't know?" "She suspected. Ruth is sharp, ruthless even. She noticed when Millicent visited a few months ago, the resemblance, the timing, the secrecy. It all pointed to something Ruth had buried long ago. That visit changed everything." There was a pause. Mabel's eyes darted toward the corner of the room. "In my suitcase," she said weakly, "beneath the linen at the bottom. I've kept the letters. Elsie's letters to Mary, some to Millicent, and something else." Miss Marple rose immediately, her body light with purpose. "Be quick," Mabel urged. "Ruth has been searching. She knows something's hidden. If she finds them first—" Miss Marple crossed the room swiftly. The suitcase sat, unassuming, beside an old chest of drawers. She knelt and opened it with care, lifting folded garments and worn underthings until her fingers brushed parchment. Tied together with a pale blue ribbon were dozens of letters, some yellowed at the edges, others newer. Beneath them, nestled inside a small paper sleeve, was a folded sheet covered in handwriting, a formula. She squinted at the contents. It wasn't a recipe or a note. It was a compound, a mixture of medicines, a combination of sedatives, muscle relaxants, and one dangerous substance often used in small doses for rare conditions but fatal in others. Miss Marple's breath caught. This wasn't just a family secret. This was a method, a means, a motive. Just then, footsteps echoed in the corridor. She closed the suitcase, returned the clothing to its original position, and tucked the letters and formula securely into her handbag, just as Ruth's voice rang out from the hallway. "Mabel, are you awake?" Miss Marple resumed her seat beside the bed, feigning calm as Ruth entered. She wore a tailored blue dress and her usual composed expression. But her eyes flickered, briefly, to the corner of the room where the suitcase lay. "I'll stay with her a while," she said flatly. "No need," Miss Marple replied with polite sweetness. "She's resting now. I'll sit quietly until the doctor returns." Ruth looked at her long and hard, then gave a tight smile. "As you wish." She left without further protest, but Miss Marple knew that look. Ruth wasn't done. When Mabel stirred again, Miss Marple leaned closer and whispered, "I've found the letters." Mabel managed a relieved smile. "Good. You're the only one I trust." Miss Marple gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Rest now. You've done more than enough." As Mabel drifted off once more, Miss Marple opened her notebook. She added a new list beneath her earlier notes. Millicent equals Elsie's daughter Alistair, equals lover banished by father letters, equals proof of lineage, formula equals possible cause of death, Ruth equals motive and opportunity, conflict equals threats confirmed. She tapped her pencil against the page. Everything was falling into place. The revised will, the hidden letters, the heated arguments, and now the formula, silent, deadly, easily administered in small doses. Elsie had been murdered, and unless she acted swiftly, Mabel might be next. Chapter 8. The Rose-Scented Silence. The sun dipped behind the hills as a cool breeze stirred the ivy climbing the stone walls of Briarwood House. Within its drawing room, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to anticipation. Miss Marple, composed yet quietly formidable, stood near the fireplace. She had requested everyone's presence for what she called a matter that must no longer remain concealed. By twilight, the room filled with all the key players in the unsettling drama, Ruth seated stiffly near the hearth, Dr. Edward calm but observant, Clara seated quietly beside Mabel, who reclined weakly on the sofa, Millicent, composed yet visibly uncertain, and the village inspector, a tall, serious man with a notebook tucked under one arm. Miss Marple began without flourish, her voice gentle but commanding. "I thank you all for coming. The truth, as I believe it to be, must now be spoken aloud. It concerns not only the death of Elsie Crowthorne, but the legacy she never lived to reveal." She turned to Ruth first. "Ruth, I know it must have been difficult to accept, but Millicent Alistair is not a stranger. She is your niece, the daughter of your youngest sister Elsie and Alistair, a man who once meant something to all three of you." Ruth's expression froze. Her fingers clutched the edge of her skirt, knuckles whitening. "That's not possible," she said flatly, but her voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Miss Marple continued, "It is possible, and it is true. Years ago, when Elsie was sent to London to protect your family's reputation, she stayed with Mary Alistair, Alistair's cousin. She gave birth to a daughter and left the child in Mary's care, maintaining contact through letters. Millicent is that child." A low murmur swept through the room. Ruth said nothing, but her eyes dropped to the floor. Miss Marple inhaled, then laid a folded paper on the table before the inspector. "But this is what truly matters now." She opened it gently. "This is a formula, a medicinal blend that includes, among its ingredients, dried rose petals laced with arsenic. A slow, cumulative poison. Administered over time, it produces symptoms that mimic natural heart failure, fatigue, dizziness, breathlessness, all of which Elsie suffered in the weeks leading to her death." Mabel sat upright, her face pale. "But how did it get into her body? How did the arsenic come?" Miss Marple turned to her with quiet gravity. "Through her tea, rose-petal tea." She then turned back to Ruth. "You've always favoured roses, haven't you, Ruth? You dried the petals yourself. You infused them in your own herbal blends. And not long ago you began preparing Elsie's tea for her each day." Silence gripped the room. "By crushing dried rose petals," Miss Marple continued, "arsenic compounds embedded in their growth, especially from older garden varieties grown with chemical treatments, can be released. If consumed steadily, in minute doses, they build up in the body. Elsie was being poisoned slowly, day after day, until her heart gave out." Ruth's face had lost all colour. Her composure was slipping. "And now," Miss Marple added quietly, "Mabel has begun to show the same symptoms because you've started dosing her too." All eyes turned to Ruth. She stood abruptly, her voice sharp and shaking. "Yes, I did it. I poisoned her." A gasp rippled across the room. "She was destroying everything," Ruth hissed. "Everything our family stood for. I found out she had married Alistair in secret, that disgraceful man who played all three of us like fools. He tricked me, led me on, then moved on to Mabel, and finally Elsie, and she married him, after Father had him banished, after he ruined us." She took a step forward, her voice growing shrill. "When I discovered she had a child with him, a child she never acknowledged publicly, it was too much. That child, Millicent, was a living symbol of betrayal, of shame, of everything I fought to bury." Tears streamed down Millicent's cheeks, but she didn't flinch. "My parents loved each other. You had no right to take her from me." Ruth whirled on her. "You were never meant to exist. You—" She caught herself, then fell back into her chair, trembling. Dr. Edwards' voice cut through the tension. "And Mabel?" "Why target her?" Ruth looked up, eyes hollow. "Because she knew. I saw it in her face. She remembered too much. She recognized Millicent for who she was. If she spoke, everything would come undone. She would turn against me." The inspector stepped forward, his voice firm and clear. "That's quite enough, Miss Crowthorne. You'll come with me now." He took out his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the murder of Elsie Crowthorne and the attempted poisoning of Mabel Crowthorne." Ruth didn't resist. As the inspector led her from the room, she cast one last bitter glance at Millicent. "I did what had to be done," she whispered, "for the family." The door closed behind them. A long silence followed. Clara reached for Millicent's hand, offering quiet comfort. Mabel, drained but composed, leaned back against her cushions, her face unreadable. Dr. Edwards stepped closer to Miss Marple. "How did you uncover it?" "It began with the symptoms," she said softly. "Then the tea, then the letters. The rest was deduction. Pride, when mixed with fear, often turns lethal." That evening, Miss Marple returned to Clara's cottage. She sat quietly in the parlour, staring out into the garden as night fell. The roses there swayed gently in the wind, silent, innocent, and red as memory. For the next few days, she visited Mabel regularly, sitting beside her in the late afternoons, speaking gently, or simply knitting in silence. There was something deeply human in Mabel's fragility, something sacred. But on the third morning, Dr. Edward came to the cottage, his hat in his hands. "She's gone," he said quietly. "Passed in the night, peacefully." Miss Marple closed her eyes, breathed in slowly and nodded. "Thank you." Later that week, she packed her bags and took the early train back to St. Mary Mead. The village welcomed her with soft rain and the sound of distant church bells. In her garden, the first spring bloom had opened, a white rose untouched. Miss Marple knelt beside it, trimmed a stray leaf, and whispered to no one in particular. "Secrets like poison always find their way to the surface.